This is an introduction to Jane Roberts' The Seth Material. In following videos, I will present the channeled material of the book chapter by chapter, and we will dive into the messages in a detailed way and cover the topics that are presented by Seth. For now, please enjoy this preface and introduction from the book. And so, we begin. An excerpt of Seth. I can assure you that death is another beginning, and that when you are dead, you are not silenced. For is this voice that you hear now silence? Is the presence that you sense within this room death? Late in 1963, Jane Roberts and her husband were experimenting with a Ouija board when a personality calling himself Seth began forming messages. Soon, Miss Roberts began passing easily into trance, her gestures, her eyes, her voice borrowed by Seth himself. The Seth Material is the documented story of how a woman who balked at the idea of life after death was confronted with overwhelming proof. Seth has diagnosed illnesses, correctly described the contents of sealed envelopes and buildings thousands of miles away, and given life readings. He has materialized apparitions in a well-lit living room and continues to amaze students of the occult and professionals alike. And from the very beginning, the text of each semi-weekly session has been recorded in full. Here is the best from an ongoing series of remarkable lectures on health, dreams, astral projection, God, reincarnation, and the mechanisms of man's subconscious. As Raymond Vanover says in his introduction, Seth, I believe, has a great talent for introducing complex and often difficult subjects simply and clearly. Philosophically, the Seth Material is some of the best of its type I have ever read. Often picking up a topic exactly where he left off 6 months before, Seth brilliantly explains many of the problems and paradoxes of the occult and gives numerous instructions for developing ESP that any reader can test for himself. Illustrated with striking photographs taken during an actual session, the Seth Material offers absorbing and convincing evidence of one of the most extraordinary psychic teachers of the century. Jane Roberts grew up in Saratoga Springs, New York, and attended Skidmore College. Before her work led her into psychic exploration, she published a number of short stories and poems in national magazines and quarterlies, and 2 novels, The Rebellers and Boondu. Her How to Develop Your ESP Power was published by Frederick File. From Dimensional Messages, another book dictated entirely in trance, Seth Speaks. The eternal validity of the soul will be provided in a separate video, which, again, we will present chapter by chapter and dive into the messages in their entirety. Preface of the book. Mediumship is a fascinating and provocative subject, for it touches upon essential questions about the mind of man, the nature of his consciousness, and even his ultimate destiny. A medium is normally defined as a person supposed to be susceptible to supernormal agencies and able to impart knowledge derived from them, or to perform actions impossible without their aid. Most people picture a medium as a lady bedecked in exotic clothing, skulking in dark corners, waiting to bilk her clients of their hard-earned money. While I have no doubt that such mediums still do exist, and have even run across some, this is hardly a complete picture. It was just before the turn of the century that mediumship became popular and spiritualism developed as its religion. Seances were then held in semi-darkness in a small, well-designed room, often resembling a small theater whose set was a chapel or had some other religious overtones. The sitters, usually emotionally overwrought by some recent tragedy in their family, were further brought to a point of hysteria by him singing and organ music. It was, overall, a well-staged production. The medium went into a trance and, through the help of her spirit control, communicated messages from departed loved ones in the spirit world. Most often these messages were trivial and even foolish, but the bereaved went home comforted that their loved ones still existed somewhere and were happy. Sometimes the medium exhibited knowledge that appeared to be some form of extrasensory perception. It was this aspect of mediumship that gave rise to parapsychology, or the controlled, scientific investigation of ESP. There is no doubt that mediumship and spiritualism were, and still are, excessively open to fraud. In the subtler realms of perception, objective evidence is hard to come by and almost impossible to place under effectively controlled conditions. In most such investigations, facts are often accepted not on evidence, of which there is little, but on faith, of which there is always an abundance. Perhaps the well-known psychical researcher Harry Price put it best when he observed that spiritualism is, at its best, a religion, at its worst, a racket. But since investigation of mediumistic trances began, it has become clear that they are a complex experience and part of a larger phenomenon, now designated as altered states of consciousness. Pathological conditions often predominate among the other types of trance, states such as comas, catalepsy, syncope, and suspended animation. All these are associated with unconsciousness, as are a number of other states resulting from certain drugs or the effects of disease upon the body chemistry. And these are all more intense than other altered states such as normal sleep, hypnosis, or somnambulism. Of the many types of altered states of consciousness, mediumship is among the most valuable, for it is in mediumship that the subjective realm of man's mind may be investigated most conveniently. Many who have studied mediumship have written that in effect it is a method for expanding awareness. British physicist Raynor Johnson has observed that there are many states in which consciousness is withdrawn from the normal waking level, which collectively we may call trance states. Some can be created by hypnosis, by drugs like mescaline, or by anesthetics, and others can be entered by certain yogic practices. A medium or a sensitive can pass voluntarily into one of these states, in which consciousness is withdrawn to an interim level of the self, and can at the same time maintain a communication line to the external world. Because it is the self-induction of a trance state and is relatively free of pathological conditions, mediumship affords a greater element of control over the experience, just as in the case of hypnosis. Jane Roberts shares a unique characteristic with a few other outstanding mediums, such as Eileen Garrett and Mrs. Osborne Leonard. Many mediums react to their own trance material with an almost religious credulity, and indeed religious convictions frequently grow out of their mediumistic experience. But in spite of their fascination with the subliminal world they have made contact with, some mediums resist the temptation to believe immediately and to depend upon the communications of a trance personality. Mrs. Garrett, for instance, has dedicated her life to investigating the meaning of mediumship, her own unconscious world, and parapsychological phenomena in general. Mrs. Leonard also dedicated herself to probing the questions of her own mediumship and allowed herself to be the subject of numerous tests. Great mediums are as rare as great musicians or great artists. Their characteristics include a peculiar mixture of susceptibility to trance states and a strong personality that is at once curious, objective, and honestly self-critical. Of course, many earmarks of the exceptional medium's character cannot be so easily characterized, but it seems clear to me that Jane Roberts is an exceptional medium. To experiment boldly with one's own subjective experience, to examine the sources of inspiration, imagination, or creativity has always been characteristic of the exceptional personality. Andre Breton, author of the Surrealist Manifesto, was obsessed with the idea of combining the real and unreal in art. Perhaps because, like the Japanese Sumi artist, he was unsure of the distinctions between the two. He conducted a series of experiments in automatic writing in an attempt to discover the arcane aspects of what we know as real. The result, Breton argued, was a purer expression of the inner man, and this wedding of the unconscious world with objective or conscious awareness is not dissimilar to the trek Jane Roberts has undertaken. For a young woman who has not spent many years in mediumship, she has come a remarkably long way toward the open, self-critical analysis necessary to truly understanding her mediumship and its broader implications. Already she has become deeply committed to the practical application of what are, basically, philosophical questions. Some of this drive, however, must be attributed to the nature of Seth, the trance personality that has developed from her mediumship. A trance personality is usually called a control because it supposedly manipulates the physical body of the entranced medium, often taking on unique and individualized characteristics. Originally, the medium's control was of course believed to be a spirit or discarnate entity who took over the medium as a means of communicating with the living. But in the world of psychic phenomena, FES, Edsel points out that the development of trance personalities or controls seems to depend on subconscious experiences related to the medium's background or environment. The questions of what a control personality is and how it communicates are extremely difficult ones that have been studied for decades by parapsychologists and depth analysts. Seth, incidentally, with common sense and honesty, it seems to me, discusses the difficult problem of distortion of fact and material coming through a medium. Because they are closely associated with supposedly supernormal powers, mediums are also expected to be absolutely 100% accurate. This, of course, is not the case, but the attitude popularly prevails and can be seen in the public attitude toward Casey or Dixon. Some believe that man has talents that can transcend the senses and quite possibly influence the unconscious without seeming to affect the conscious mind at all. Edsel writes that experiences related to a medium's environment might play a part in the formation of these extraordinary secondary personalities that, in the case of certain outstanding mediums, seem so uncannily all-knowing. Many psychological theories have been put forward to explain the existence of transpersonalities, such as New York analyst Ira Progoff's theory of the dynotype. After extensive research with Eileen Garrett, Progoff concluded that the presence of the various control figures is essential to maintaining a balance in Mrs. Garrett's psyche. Dr. Progoff views control figures in mediumship not as spirit entities, but as symbolic forms of dramatization by which larger principles of life are made articulate in human experience. Similarly, Socrates had his personal daimon, Graves his white goddess of poetry, and Noah in drunken dreams perceived himself as the incarnation of his own ancestors, first Adam, then Jeremiah. Each man, so the theory relates, personifies in such a way what he is, subliminally. Psychics such as Mrs. Garrett have speculated that perhaps they create their own alternative selves, only in a more recognizable and reasonable form as such daimons or spirit controls. W. H. Salter, a well-known and objective psychical researcher, made another point, however. If the transpersonality continues to communicate year after year, never puts the mental or emotional emphasis wrong, and never speaks out of character, it is hard to construct a plausible explanation out of subconscious inference and dramatization on the medium's part. The final, definitive answers lie somewhere in the future. And while it is important to ask questions, such inquiries should not supersede other equally important aspects of mediumship. The content of a medium's trance communications is often overlooked, undoubtedly because most of the time, they are somewhat foolish and incoherent statements. But again, in those rare instances such as the trance utterances of Edgar Cayce, there appear important and provocative ideas that demand consideration. And communications through Jane Roberts, trance, personality, Seth, deserve such attention. The best trance material shows good psychological insight communicated through a compassionate, strong personality, and the Seth material conveys all of these qualities. Seth, however, adds one ingredient that most trance material lacks: clarity of thought and presentation. Most trance material, from ancient as well as modern mediumistic controls, couches itself not only in jumbled syntax but confused thought. However, Seth, I believe, has a great talent for introducing complex and often difficult subjects simply and clearly. To the practiced eye, the professional philosopher, and the academic parapsychologist, he will sometimes seem to deal with the familiar. His feeling that one's mind leaves the body during sleep, for instance, is classical and harkens back to primitive times. But to those just beginning their acquaintance with the fascinating world of dreams, ESP, and the other phenomenal aspects of the unconscious, Seth will be a crystal-sighted teacher. And it is to these, the seeker, the questioner, that Seth continually addresses himself. The stated purpose of his communications is to provide a means by which people can understand themselves better, reevaluate their reality, and change it. In the chapter on inner sensing, Seth offers clear and sound advice on how to go about expanding one's awareness and developing meditational techniques and ESP. Again, unique to Seth and a few others, such as Edgar Cayce's trance communications, is a large dose of common sense advice and sympathetic concern for individual problems that heavily dilute the philosophical and metaphysical speculations. These elements seem one of the prime characteristics of the Seth material and are surely the ones I personally find most attractive. Interestingly, Seth's personality and presentation are so individualistic that after a short period of familiarization, one tends to regard them as coming from a trained modern intellect rather than from the opposite side of Isis veil. The material also covers a surprisingly broad range of ideas, which are often intriguing and original. I am particularly interested in Seth's treatment of personality fragment projection, which is strongly in the tradition of the Teutonic doppelganger and the Slavic Vartiger. This is a very widespread phenomenon. Even Freud, for instance, saw his doppelganger, fleetingly, in a mirror. De Maupassant once saw his double walk into a room, sit down in front of him, and dictate part of a book that had been giving the French author particular trouble. When finished, it stood up and vanished. I only wish Seth would more clearly describe the mechanics of the thing as opposed to the theory. There is also, of course, the occult tradition of thought form projection as described by Mrs. David Neal when she created her Tibetan tulpa. Indeed, an idea is an event, according to Seth. It is therefore logical that any idea, in whatever sphere of activity, whether physically materialized or not, would have an impact upon our lives. The idea as reality is another ancient concept which was formalized early in Western civilization by Plato, and which has been retained by many philosophers down through the ages. But rather than discuss this concept in abstract terms only, Seth develops it to its logical conclusion. All ideas, thoughts, and areas of concentration help create a dynamic and continually interrelating universe, with the idea playing as important and as tangible a role as any physical event. Seth's theory on the crucifixion is an ideal example. According to Seth, the crucifixion originated in the universe of dreams, occurring within another reality and emerged into history as an idea. Seth is not saying that the crucifixion was just a dream, rising from a common need within man, but an idea being actualized in another realm of time and space that affected our temporal world and changed our civilization. This is, of course, interesting speculation, but consider for a minute how readily we accept the simple philosophical dictum that an idea can change the world. There are many examples. Man cannot live by bread alone. Love thy neighbor as thyself. In our daily lives, we try to manifest these ideas into reality, to make them move from the abstract world into the temporal one of cause and effect. Seth, in effect, is turning the tables on us by suggesting that reality can perhaps function in the other direction as well. The idea is reality which has a profound effect upon the temporal world all the time. The problem is to broaden our perceptual base and awareness so that temporal consciousness can manifest itself in this world of ideas, so we can become aware of the impact of this world of ideas upon our civilization and our personal lives. Seth says that the dream universe possesses concepts which will someday completely transform the history of the physical world, but a denial of such concepts as possibilities delays their emergence. Kant, much of whose philosophy rests on the concept that mind imposes reality on the data of sense, would have probably agreed with Seth that the senses create the material world rather than simply perceiving it. Also, within Seth's comments are passing glimpses of material that is so thought-provoking that it deserves considerably more attention than it receives. Seth mentions, for example, the existence of symbolic figures which assume identifiable forms within the unconscious in order to communicate more effectively. This is an area of research devoid of hard facts, but rich in speculation and experiential reports. The great Swiss psychoanalyst Carl Jung noted the existence of what he called archetypal figures in the unconscious who often communicate to the conscious mind through the symbolic garb of mythical, religious, or great historical figures. Jung himself spent years communicating with Philemon, an archetypal figure in his own unconscious. Masters and Houston, after extensive research into the effects of LSD, classified the drug-induced expansion of consciousness into 4 categories. In the third or symbolic level, they reported the consistent manifestation of historical or legendary persons and an abundance of mythical symbols. Philosophically, the Seth Material is some of the best of its type I have ever read. A comparative study of Seth's thought should prove very interesting. His material is complex enough so that even the confines of this large book are not adequate. Naturally, it is therefore impossible to summarize it all in this short introduction. Many questions came to mind during the reading. Many have remained unresolved, but to my mind, this is not a bad thing. After all, if we are mentally, emotionally, or spiritually stimulated to ask questions, probe our standardized attitudes, and press beyond the limits of our prejudices into ever-widening areas of thought, we can accomplish much. This, I believe, is the greatest value of the Seth personality and his communications. As he himself has indicated, he is a communicator and a stimulator of thought as too few temporal teachers are. No one can possibly know where this search is going to lead, but of one thing we can be sure. Records of trance communications like the Seth Material are of inestimable value, for they afford the rare opportunity of delving into the subjective mind of man. This is not a casual or passing benefit, for it is a glimpse into the headwaters of a river that is at once mysterious, provocative, and vitally important for humanity's well-being. This is the spring where inspiration drinks, where intuition sparks the scientific mind, where poets' dreams burst forth, and where a major portion of our lives, in terms of both time and energy, are spent. Raymond Van Over, New York, New York. Introduction by Jane Roberts. It was February 29th, 1968. I was holding one of my twice-weekly ESP classes. The large bay window was open, letting in the unusually warm night air. The lights were normally lit in my living room where classes are held. Suddenly I felt that we had a visitor. As always, I went into trance easily, without preamble. This class was composed of college girls. They had read my first book, knew about Seth, and had attended a few classes, but they had never witnessed a Seth session. My eyes closed. When they opened a few moments later, they were much darker. I began to speak for Seth. He had thrown my glasses to the floor in a quick, characteristic gesture, yet now I scrutinized each student with sharp, clear focus. The voice that spoke was deep, quite loud, more masculine than feminine. We were having a spontaneous Seth session. It served to introduce the students to Seth, and I will let a few excerpts from it serve the same purpose now, introducing Seth to those readers who have not heard of him. According to what you have been taught, you are composed of physical matter and cannot escape it, and this is not so. The physical matter will disintegrate, but you will not. Though you cannot find me, know that I am here. Your own parents seem to disappear before your eyes and vanish into nothingness forever. I can assure you that they will continue to live. I can assure you that death is another beginning, and that when you are dead, you are not silenced. For is this voice that you hear now silence? Is this presence that you sense within this room death? I am here to tell you that your joy is not dependent upon your youth, for I am hardly young. I am here to tell you that your joy is not dependent upon your physical body, for in your terms I have none. I have what I have always had, the identity that is mine. It is never diminished. It grows and develops. You are what you are, and you will be more. Do not be afraid of change, for you are change, and you change as you sit before me. All action is change, for otherwise there would be a static universe, and then indeed death would be the end. What I am is also what you are, individualized consciousness. Change with the seasons, for you are more than the seasons. You form the seasons. They are the reflections of your inner psychic climate. I came for one purpose this evening, so that you could sense my vitality, and sensing it, know that I speak to you from dimensions beyond those with which you are acquainted. The grave is not the end. For such a noisy one as I never spoke with the lips of death. I am in this room, although there is no object within which you can place me. You are as disembodied as I. You have a vehicle to use, a body that you call your own, and that is all. I borrow Rupert's, Seth's name for me. In addition, Seth always speaks of me as male, with his consent, but what I am is not dependent upon atoms and molecules, and what you are is not dependent upon physical matter. You have lived before and will live again, and when you are done with physical existence, you will still live. I come here as though I appeared through a hole in space and time. There are walks in space and time through which you can travel, and in dreams you have been where I am. I want you to feel your own vitality. Feel it travel through the universe, and know that it is not dependent upon your physical image. In reality, you project your own energy out to form the physical world. Therefore, to change your world, it is yourself you must change. You must change what you project. You always were, and you always will be. This is the meaning of existence and joy. The God that is within you, for you are a part of all that is. Seth spoke through me for over 2 hours, so quickly that the students had trouble taking notes. His joy and vitality were obvious. The personality was not mine. Seth's dry, sardonic humor shone from my eyes. The muscles of my face rearranged themselves into different patterns. My normally feminine gestures were replaced by his. Seth was enjoying himself in the guise of an old man, shrewd, lively, quite human, when he spoke of the joy of existence, ringing even through such a voice as his. That deep voice boomed. Later, one of the students, Carol, told me that although she knew the words were coming from my mouth, still she felt that they were coming from all over, from the walls themselves. During a break, Carol read the notes that she had taken. Suddenly, without transition, I was Seth again, leaning forward, joking, "If you are to be my stenographer, you must do better than that. You are a mad scribbler." Then a give-and-take period began in which Seth corrected Carol's notes as she read them, added several remarks to clear certain sentences, and bantered back and forth with her. The students asked questions, and Seth answered them. This was a very simple session. Seth addressed himself to the students for the first time, yet he touched upon several issues that appear often in the Seth material. The personality is multidimensional. The individual is basically free of space and time. The fate of each of us is in our own hands. Problems not faced in this life will be faced in another. We cannot blame God, society, or our parents for misfortunes, since before this physical life we chose the circumstances into which we would be born and the challenges that could best bring about our development. We form physical matter as effortlessly and unself-consciously as we breathe. Telepathically, we are all aware of the mass ideas from which we form our overall conception of physical reality. As of December 1969, my husband, Rob, and I have held over 500 Seth sessions over a period of 5 years. My first book in this field, How to Develop Your ESP Power, briefly explained the circumstances leading to my interest in ESP and the experiments that led to my introduction to Seth. Since then, Seth has demonstrated telepathic and clairvoyant abilities on occasions too frequent to mention. Through sessions, he has helped friends, strangers, and students, and by following his instructions, my husband and I are learning to develop our own psychic potentials. Yet I was not a born psychic with a background of paranormal experience. Neither Rob nor I had any knowledge of such matters. Even after my first enthusiasm, I didn't accept these developments without serious self-questioning and intellectual analysis. I wanted to keep my experiences on as scientific a basis as possible. Yes, I said in effect, I do speak in trance for a personality who claims to have survived death. Yes, you can develop your own extrasensory abilities. Yes, Seth does insist that reincarnation is a fact. But, I found the ideas presented in the Seth Material fascinating, but I was not about to accept them as the same kind of solid fact with which I accepted, say, the bacon I eat for breakfast. Now I know they are far more important. To me, it was tantamount to intellectual suicide to even admit the possibility that Seth actually was a personality who had survived death. Nowhere in my first book did I say that I thought Seth was exactly what he said he was, an energy personality essence no longer focused in physical reality. Instead, I studied the various explanations for such personalities given by psychologists and parapsychologists on the one hand, and by spiritualists on the other. Nowhere did I find an explanation as logical and consistent as that given in the Seth Material itself. I was so used to thinking of myself as a physical creature bound to space and time that I almost refused to accept the evidence of my own experience. While involved in the most intuitive work in the world, I tried to become more and more objective. I tried to step back into a world I had really left forever. A universe in which nothing existed except in physical terms, a world in which communications from any other realities or dimensions were impossible. Yet, we continued to have Seth sessions twice a week. I began to have out-of-body experiences, astral projections, as I sat in the living room, speaking for Seth. Seth described what I saw while my own consciousness was miles away, perceiving locations and events in another town or state. Our files contained statements from two brothers in California, for example, asserting that Seth correctly described their home and neighborhood while I spoke for him in Elmira, New York, some 3,000 miles away. I could hardly deny those facts. Following publication of my earlier book, letters came from strangers asking for help or advice. Finally, I agreed to hold a few sessions for those most in need, though the responsibility frightened me. The people involved didn't attend the sessions since they lived in other parts of the country, yet they said the advice helped them. Information given concerning individual backgrounds was correct. Seth often explained problems as the result of unresolved stresses in past reincarnational lives, and gave specific advice as to how the individuals could use their abilities now to meet these challenges. Before this, I had suspected that the reincarnational data was a delightful dish of fantasy cooked up by my own subconscious. When all this began, in fact, I wasn't at all sure that we survived death once, much less over and over again. Rob and I were hardly religious in conventional terms. We haven't been to a church in years, except to attend weddings or funerals. I was brought up a Catholic, but as I grew older, I found it more and more difficult to accept the God of my ancestors. Irony whispered that he was as dead as they were. The heaven that had sustained me as a child seemed in my teens to be a shallow mockery of meaningful existence. Who wanted to sit around singing hymns to a father god, even if he did exist? And what sort of intelligent God would require such constant adoration? A very insecure, appallingly human kind of God indeed. The alternative, that of hellfire, was equally unbelievable. Yet the conventional God of our fathers apparently sat without a qualm with the blessed in heaven, while the devil tortured the rest of the unlucky dead. That God, I decided, was out. I would not tolerate him as a friend. For that matter, he didn't treat his son too well either, as the story goes. But Christ you could at least respect, I thought. He'd been here. He knew how it was. Before I was 20, then, I'd left behind me that archaic God, the Virgin, and the communion of saints. Heaven and hell, angels and devils, were dismissed. This particular group of chemicals and atoms I called me would fall into no such traps, at least none that I could recognize. Rob's background was different. His parents' brand of religion was a sort of social Protestantism, rather delightfully innocent of dogma. In general, God loved little boys and girls with starched shirts, acceptable addresses, polished shoes, and fathers who made good money. It also helped if their mothers baked cookies for the PDA. Neither of us was bitter about such a God's apparent injustices. We didn't pay him that much attention. I had my poetry. Rob, who was an artist, had his painting. Each of us felt a strong sense of contact with nature. No one was more surprised than I was then, to find myself quite abruptly speaking for someone who was supposed to have survived death. I berated myself at times, thinking that even my Irish grandmother would have found spirits in the living room rather hard to take, and I used to think she was superstitious. A surviving soul seemed part and parcel of the adult's nonsense I'd thought I'd escaped, thanks to a college education, a quick mind, and a fine dose of native rebelliousness. It took me a while to discover that I was being as prejudiced against the idea of survival as some others were for it. Now I realize that while I was priding myself on my open-mindedness, my mental flexibility extended only to ideas that fit in with my own preconceptions. Now I know that human personality has a far greater reality than we are usually prepared to give it. Someone has produced over 50 notebooks of fascinating material, and even at my most skeptical moments I have to accept the reality of the sessions and the material. The scope, quality, and theories of the material hooked us almost at once. Rob and I are both convinced that the Seth material springs from sources beyond myself, and that it is much less distorted by conventionalized symbolism than our other paranormal scripts we have encountered. Seth says this material has been given by himself and others in other times and places, but that it is given again, in new ways, for each succeeding generation through the centuries. The reader will have to make his own judgments, but personally I do accept his theories as valid and significant. Moreover, the riddle of such personalities as Seth, call it spirit possession, a demon, as Socrates did, has concerned mankind through the ages. The phenomenon is hardly new. Through telling my own story and presenting the material, I hope to throw some light upon the nature of such experiences and to show that human personality has abilities still to be tapped and other ways to receive knowledge than those it usually employs. The Seth material has completely changed my ideas of the nature of reality and reinforced my sense of identity. No longer do I feel as I did before, that man is the slave of time, illness, decay, and at the mercy of built-in destructive tendencies over which he has no control. I feel in control of my own destiny as never before and no longer ruled by patterns subconsciously set during my childhood. I don't mean to imply that I feel myself entirely released from every worry and fear, only that I now know we do have the freedom to change ourselves and our environment, and that in a very basic manner, we ourselves form the environment to which we then react. I believe that we form our own reality now and after death. The purpose of this book is to introduce you to Seth and the Seth material. Though Seth has appeared only once in a physical materialization, Rob has seen him clearly enough to paint a portrait of him that hangs in our living room, as seen in this video. Through me, Seth has produced a continuing manuscript that runs well over 5,000 double-spaced typewritten pages in not quite 5 years' time. I know many living persons who haven't produced that much in a lifetime. Yet my own work continues. Since the sessions began, I've written 2 books of nonfiction, not counting this one, 2 of poetry, and a dozen short stories. Seth certainly hasn't stolen any of my own creative energy for his own purposes. The first chapters of this book will deal with the emergence of Seth's personality and the impact he had on our lives as we tried to understand what was happening. Out of nowhere, it seemed, I found myself having experiences that I considered nearly impossible. Never in our lives had we found ourselves so caught between curiosity and caution, so fascinated and baffled. Excerpts from some of the early sessions will also be included in the first chapters, since Seth's ideas were then as new and strange to us as the sessions themselves. But the main emphasis will be on the story itself, from the first Ouija board experiment through the first instance when I startled Rob and myself by speaking for Seth, and the changes in our attitudes as further developments occurred. I'll also include examples of Seth's clairvoyant abilities. The bulk of the book will deal with Seth's ideas on various subjects, such as life after death, reincarnation, health, the nature of physical reality, the God concept, dreams, time, identity, and perception. I'm sure that these excerpts from the material itself and some sample reincarnational readings will give most readers greater insights into their own personalities and the situations in which they find themselves. I hope that Seth's theories on health will benefit all my readers, and that the material on personality will help each discover for himself the multidimensional reality that is his heritage. The philosophical and psychological implications of mediumship and ESP phenomena and the possible origins of the Seth material, along with several questions concerning Seth's independent reality, will be considered. I'll also give Seth's advice as to the development of psychic abilities. Someone who was familiar with psychic literature and paranormal experiences would have been better prepared for these events than I was, but I would not have missed them for the world. Okay, so that was the preface and the introduction of the Seth material from Jane Roberts. In future videos, I will present the chapters. After the complete book has been posted, we will do a deep dive into the implications of the material in our daily lives. Also, in future videos, as we progress and add more material from other channelers, we will begin to compare the messages, pointing out similarities or discrepancies and what they may mean. So, stay tuned. Hit the like button and subscribe so that we can keep this going. If you have questions or comments, that'd be great. And if you want us to focus on any particular channeler or a particular message, just let us know and we'll get on it. Thanks for watching and have a blessed day.